Hey everyone, it's Rob. I'm back with another retro video game video. This one is instructional, and I'm sure you can tell by the title of this video. Today we're going to be doing an RGB mod on a Nintendo64. And here we have the Nintendo64 that I'm using. So let me go over a couple of the things that you're going to need before you get started. First and foremost, you have to have an N64 that's capable of being RGB modded. Now I'm not going to go into the intricacies of why you should RGB mod or what it is. Let's just cut it short and say RGB modding your N64 is going to give you the best possible video. You can get pretty close with S-Video, and there's other mods for component and all that stuff. But if you want the absolute purest analog video from your N64, you want an RGB mod, okay? So anyway, going back to the N64 itself, you need for it to be a serial number beginning with, let me see if I can get this on the screen. You should be able to see it there. Beginning with NS1. Now there's some various reports as to what can follow the 1. I think that pretty much anything with NS1 should work, if I understand this correctly. This is actually my first N64 RGB mod. I've modded a Super Nintendo Mini before, and it's pretty much the same exact thing as this, except for there's an extra step where you have to hook up a C-Sync and a composite sync that it doesn't normally have. And I don't think you have to do this for the N64 if you use the correct RGB SCART cable, and I can talk about that later. But anyway, yeah, going back to this, you need to have a serial number that starts with the NS1. If you really want to know, you really have to open it up and check the chip inside that we're reliant on to get the RGB from. But if you go, I'm getting all this from retrorgb.com. If you've never been there before and you're interested in retro RGB for any retro video game console at all, I mean, I'm talking Atari all the way to Xbox. It's just a great page, and not only that, but they sell one of the key components that I'm going to be using in this video other than the Nintendo 64 itself, and it's this little guy right here. You're going to need this or build your own. I don't have the materials or really the want to build my own. Let me see if I can get a good picture of this. This, let's see, there it is. This, as you can see, it says Retro RGB. This is an RGB amplifier. So what this does is it takes the RGB signal from the Nintendo 64 or the Super Nintendo, it works actually on both, and it amplifies it so that it becomes a usable signal. And I'm going to be hooking it up to a Sony BVM or PVM, but anything that accepts RGB SCART, or any RGB at all, really, if you're using a FrameMeister, you'll just need a different cable. But anything that you want to output RGB to, it probably will be too weak unless you use one of these RGB amps. And again, you can buy this really nice pre-made one. They're about $25 after shipping, I think, from retrorgb.com. So they're pretty simple to install. You'll see here there's an RGB little solder points there. That's where you're going to be taking the RGB from the motherboard or from the chip directly to here, and then this amplifies the signal. And these little holes here, they actually fit over a part of the motherboard where there's pins on the other side of the motherboard, and you solder these in place, and what it'll do is it'll amplify the RGB and output it to the pins, which are connected to the multi-out on the back of the Nintendo 64. So if you don't know what the multi-out is, it's this. Should be able to see that, kind of. So, oh, it's upside down. There it is, multi-out. This port has all the video and audio out for Nintendo 64. Super Video or S-Video and Composite is there by default. And you can buy S-Video. Honestly, I've seen video comparisons between S-Video and RGB, and it's actually pretty close as long as you use a really good monitor or TV. If you have a Sony PVM or something equivalent to that, and you hook it up with S-Video, it's going to look miles better than if you hook this up to a shitty RGB monitor. So really, you can't overlook the CRT itself. It goes a long way with giving you a really good picture. I actually hook up a regular Nintendo Entertainment System, a regular ass NES, and use composite video, and it looks superb on a PVM. So don't overlook that. But anyway, this multi-out has the pinouts that we're going to be using to get the RGB out of this. So let's start. Part one here is we're going to open this guy up. And let me go a couple, actually we already went over the chip. So you need the chip, and you're gonna need a 4.5 millimeter game bit. Okay, so the Nintendo 64 and all Nintendo products and some other companies too have a special screw. It's a security measure so that, you know, consumers can't open up their systems. There's a 4.5 millimeter and a 3.8 millimeter. Usually you find them in sets when you buy them, because the 3.8 millimeter is for opening cartridges, like Nintendo cartridges, and the 4.5 usually opens their systems. So you're gonna need the 4.5 millimeter bit, and I just use a standard screwdriver with that accepts bits. So you just put that like that. Make sure it's kind of small, because sometimes there will be holes that you can't get in if the opening's too wide for your screwdriver. So you'll need this bit, and you'll also need thin gauge wire. So this is 30 gauge. It might be thinner than you actually need, but this is what I use for my Super Nintendo RGB mod, and it works fine. You can get thicker gauge. So I actually have red, green, and blue, and then, you know, for 5 volts or ground or whatever, I can use this. But this is a little bit thicker gauge. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I can probably get away with using this, but you know, once I get in there, I'm going to see which one I'm going to use. And then also, if you look at the Retro RGB webpage on the instructions on how to do this, they also recommend that you put a little bit of electrical tape on the back of the RGB amp, but it's probably not necessary since there's nothing there, but I'm going to go ahead and follow directions on that. You also might notice that I'm working on this, what looks like to be clouds, but it's not. It's actually a towel. And honestly, I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to be doing that, but I don't give a shit. I use a towel because when I take out the screws and they fall out, they don't roll away, right? And it's easy to set them aside. And if you're just working on a workbench or, you know, plain wooden or plastic table, those screws just go everywhere. So I like the towel. It may introduce, you know, some of you electrical engineers out there may be going, oh no, what are you doing? You know, you might run into issues with static electricity. You're not wearing a static wristband. No, I'm not. That's a risk that I'm taking. Don't do what I'm doing. Actually use the precautions and use a static wristband, and, you know, do all that good stuff so you don't damage your N64. Anyway, moving along, let's go ahead and get this sucker open. It's actually pretty simple to open this guy up. There's just a few screws, and again, these are special security screws that are opened by Gamebit 4.5 millimeter, and there's not that many of them. I actually have not opened this one before. I opened up another one, but it turned out it had the wrong chip. It had the wrong serial number, so I couldn't use it. This one I'm working on right now is actually the one that I bought on launch day back in September of 1996. I believe it was September 26th, because that's my friend Tony's birthday. Tony, if you're watching, I do remember that. I'll always remember that your birthday coincided with the Nintendo 64 launch. And I believe that it was actually supposed to launch on the 29th, but some retailers broke street date, and then Nintendo said, screw it, just go ahead and release it. And it ended up releasing on my friend Tony's birthday. So I remember that day. This is an original N64 first model. If you have a colored N64, I can almost guarantee you, unless they've swapped the shell, that you do not have the correct chip to output RGB. Again, if you have any questions on what Nintendo 64s are capable of outputting RGB, go to retrorgb.com. It's a great resource. So I'm going to take these feet off. I believe those are the only 6, and let's get this guy out. Come on. No, that didn't work. It's not quite all the way. There's one. So I put these off to the side. I like to put them in the same order, put them away in the same order that I pull them out, because I run into issues where you pull out the screws and they all look the same, but certain ones just fit naturally better. They're threaded for a specific hole. Usually it's not a problem, but why risk it? If you can keep them, I mean, you don't have to. If you can keep them in the order that they were pulled out. I saw a guy that was really clever, and he actually drew an outline of what he was taking apart, you know, just quickly with pencil on a piece of paper, and then he would punch the the screws into the paper where they were actually they came from. So this guy's being a little booger. Why are you being tough? You're being a jerk. See, now this guy may be one of those holes where that screw is like specially made for that. Well, not specially made, but it just works better. So I'm keeping them in the same order that I pulled them out, and I know they're off screen, but I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Keep those together. Flip it over. Now this thing does have a memory expansion pack, and I forgot to take this out, but no worries. You can just grab that out. Let me grab a screwdriver. You need a flathead screwdriver, which I'm sure I have someplace. I have a lot of screwdrivers here. Where is my flathead? Okay, let me go to my toolbox, and there it is. There's one of them. So you can just gently pry this out if you have one. If you don't, you might have a jumper. So this thing, it's an expansion pack that basically adds memory to your N64, so you can run certain games at higher resolutions. Some run at better frame rates, some give you an option. Some require it, like Donkey Kong 64, I think requires it, and it came with it. But anyway, you gotta pull that out, and then you should be able to, yep, it just comes straight out. So there is the inside. Put that away. Now you notice there are a ton of screws here, right? There are a whole bunch. Again, if you go to retrorgb.com, and I'm looking at this laptop off screen because I don't have these memorized, it shows you exactly which screws you can remove. You can remove more than it says, but there's really no need to. So where is my, there it is. I do have my Phillips head screwdriver. And so I have to remove this one here. So it looks like there's a screw missing here, but when I opened up the other one that ended up not supporting RGB, I noticed that it looks like there was a screw missing, but it looks like this one's missing it too. And now that I look at the picture from retrorgb.com, their N64 doesn't have it either. So I guess I just didn't have a screw there. It's kind of weird. But I'm gonna put these again. I'm gonna put them off screen in the same order I'm pulling them off. And it looks like, nope, that's the game bit. It looks like on each side of this, oh boy, those are tiny. You have to remove these guys here. So I need a small screwdriver. And I'm sure I have one. Where is it? Let's see, put this here. All right. Remove these guys. And you're basically going to remove the shielding. All right. And then what else? We need to remove this. And then looks like there is one right next to the switch. I don't even see one here. No, there's not one here. There is one there though. Looks like they've circled one on this website that doesn't actually exist. So I also have the benefit of this video, so I can see exactly where these screws came from just by watching this video. And in fact, you can too. You have the benefit of that too. So then we're going to take this one off here. If I can get it. So the problem is this screwdriver is not magnetic. I do have a little short stubby screwdriver when I do it that has a magnetic tip. And just for these purposes, it's good to have. There it is. I actually have a magnet as well, but I don't know where it is. I don't want to look for it, so we just use that screwdriver. So back to here, we got to do this one. And again, let's use this Mr. Stubby here to grab that. Okay, and we have a couple here that we want to take out. Let's use this one, it's easier. Okay, almost there. And we have a couple on either side of the cartridge slot. Okay. And then we have 4 left. It's going to be these 2 here and these 2 here. So let's go ahead and go to left one first. There. And finally these 2. Get in there. I already see one that I missed. All right. And there's one that I missed right here. I can't imagine this one doesn't have to come off. This has to come off. It has to. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, their photo is wrong. They have something circled here, but not here, so they have these 2 reversed. So unless they have a different revision where it reversed the screw in the pin, the plastic pin. So, no big deal. All right, and I think that should do it for the shielding. Well, there it comes. So you can pull this out. And here we have the motherboard with the shielding still there. Shielding on the bottom goes back in. And here's where you're going to be doing your work. Okay, now I know it's a little far from the camera there, but your work's going to be all in this area here, and specifically, let me see if I can get a close up. All right, so welcome to part 2. So towards the end of that video, I didn't realize that the N64 was kind of off screen there. Not too big a deal. Normally I'd redo it, but it's really not that big a deal. I think that, you know, you can figure it out removing the screws based on the web page from Retro RGB. But anyway, I was a little confused as to why we still had this on, because although most of the work is on the back side, you only need to take this off if you need to verify that you have the correct chip. So I went ahead and, you know, saved you all some time of me removing more screws. So I removed all these screws here. That's basically the screws that we had remaining. And now we'll be able to remove this stuff and take a look at the chip to confirm that it is an RGB moddable video chip. So how to, there it is. I don't lose any parts. Oh, there we go. It's off. And so what we're looking for, let me go back to my page here, is up in this area here. We're looking specifically at this chip right here. Let me get a close-up of it. We're looking at this chip right here, and you'll see that, let me get a better picture there. This one says VDCNUS and then space A. So this is a chip that does support RGB. If you have an N64 that doesn't have either VDCNUS or NUSA, then you will have to do something special. There is a way to get RGB out of non-NS1 serial number N64s, but it's more involved and it requires a totally separate chip and procedure. I didn't look into it too much, but if you have NS1 on yours, you should be able to open it up and verify that you have this VDC NUS or NUSA chip. So we're good to go. That's all that was for. You don't, if you're very confident that you have a version that supports it, if you have a low serial number N64, you don't care to check it. I mean, I would probably do it anyway. It takes as much time as, you know, just a couple of minutes to take out all the screws, check it, because you don't want to do all that work and then figure out at the end that your chip didn't support the RGB amp, and then you wasted all that time for no reason. So it's probably worthwhile to go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to go ahead and pause it and get this part back on because we don't really need it. Okay, I'm back, and all I've done is replace these screws here to the heatsink and a little bit of shielding here that goes around the expansion port. Now, I kind of wish I had the video camera on for a part of that because those are a little tedious. Something to note about these screws, in fact all of these screws, is when I first started screwing them in, they gave me a lot of resistance. When I pulled them out, they were very smooth. And I kept them in the right order, so when I was putting them in, I was noticing it just seemed too tough for what it, they're very short screws. And so I figured out that if you put the screw in and you turn it counterclockwise until it clicks in place, and then screw it in clockwise, that it would be much smoother. Because the first few, I kind of tightened them in, I'm like, these are not going in correctly. They were a little off kilter or something, and the threads weren't lining up correctly, and I didn't want to strip them. So I figured out, yeah, if you just put it in and then counterclockwise until they snap in place and then go clockwise, you'll have a much easier time and end up getting through those that way. So just a little tip there for that. So yeah, the heatsink is back in place. Okay, so now that we've confirmed that we have the right type of chip in order to do an RGB mod, what we're going to do is find the places on the motherboard where we need to do the soldering. So you could actually do it from the other side. You could, if you leave the heatsink off, you can actually tap right into that VDC NUS or NUSA chip. And from pins 17, 19, and 21, you can grab respectively R, G, and B, red, green, and blue. But I think it's much easier and cleaner to do that from the backside. So if you recall, the VDC NUSA chip was, oops, it's going to come off, was around this area here, right? So if you flip it over and around that same area, you will see that we see the underside solder points for that very same chip. And you'll see three very specific ones that we're concerned with here. Let me confirm that these are the right ones, yeah. So it's R8, 9, and 10. Let me get you a little closer look at those. Let's see if I can point to them. So they're right there. R8, 9, and 10. Those are the RGB outs that basically coincide to the other side of the VDC chip. And over here is the multi-out. So if you look here, there's a multi-out. And here are the solder points for the multi-out. And again, the RGB amp just fits right on top of those. And then you're going to solder a few of those points. You don't need to solder them all, although if you do, it doesn't hurt anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to solder some wires to R8, R9, and R10. And then we're going to solder the RGB amp in place here with the appropriate solder points. And then we're going to connect the two, right? And then that should give us the RGB going from there into the amplifier, out to the multi-out, and then you can output RGB, out from here. Well, I didn't actually like the thicker gauge wire after all. So I went back with my 30 gauge. So I think 30 gauge is the way to go. You can get it into that little hole a bit. I was worried that maybe I couldn't get enough of a contact with a thicker gauge wire because it didn't go through the hole. So although it doesn't look as cool, well, I mean, maybe even look better because the wire is green and it'll blend in, but not really going for looks at this point. And I know it's really cool to have the red, green, and blue wires match red, green, and blue, but ultimately it doesn't matter as long as it conducts the right signal or sends the right signal through the wire. It doesn't matter the color of the wire. So I went ahead and cut 3 different wires for the connection from the R8 and 9 to the RGB over here on the RGB amp. But before I do that, I'm actually going to solder this guy in place. So you'll note that there are 6 holes on the top and 6 holes on the bottom, and they coincide with the 12 pins on the multi-out, but you don't actually need to solder them all. The only ones you need to solder are the top, going from the right side, the top 3, and then you skip one, and then the 5th one. So you need the top 3, skip, and then this one here. So you need to solder those. And then on the bottom, you only need 2. You need the furthest to the right on the bottom, and then skipping one, and then the one 2 to the left of that. So you need a total of 6 solder points. And if you look at the RGB amp from the side, you can see that those are the only ones that have any kind of metal around the circles. If you happen to put solder on the other holes, it's not going to hurt anything. There's no connection there, but it's completely unnecessary. So let me go ahead and do that. I have some silver solder here. Let me cut off a good piece. And so I'm not the best at soldering. I can do it. It's functional. I've soldered many different things, but my technique isn't by any means something that you should try to emulate. Part of it, I think, is that I have a really crappy soldering iron, and I tried to get a good one. I paid like 20 or 30 bucks for this one. It's kind of cool because it has LED lights on it. So that is actually pretty helpful. But the tip I had that came with it, it was way too thick. And this tip here, although it was the thinnest one I could find, I actually bought it at Fry's Electronics. I didn't buy the, I think actually I bought this at another store called Altex, which is an electronic shop here in Austin. But anyway, Fry's Electronics had a lot of tips for Weller soldering guns or irons, and I couldn't find one that fit perfectly. So this one doesn't quite, it's a little too thin. And it fits in there and you can screw it in place, but it doesn't have full contact, so it doesn't get as hot as it's supposed to. So to make your life easier, get a good soldering iron or gun, and that way you don't struggle as much as I do. But in any case, this should work as long as I use the right side of it. I'm gonna try to get these solder points in here. Again, my technique isn't the best, but it does work eventually. And this gun is just not good. It will go from not doing anything to completely melting it. So I have another one that's a little bit better, but the tip is not interchangeable and it's really big. See, I can't even get the solder to stay on the, so it's too much solder there. I think you need to like tin this thing. So get this off of there. Okay, I'm going to, so I've got the RGB amp soldered on here. All I've done is taken the solder gun, or a solder, I keep calling it solder gun, but it's soldering iron. Hard to see here, so I can get it. There we go. And I've soldered on this point here, these three here, and then these two here. So we got 4 on the top and 2 on the bottom. And the other ones are just blanks, they're just placeholders. They're holes for the pins to go through, but you don't actually need to solder them. So as you can see, I did an okay job of soldering. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as they're not touching. These two are dangerously close to touching, but this should be fine. This should be okay. And then here, I've taken some solder and I filled in R8, R9, and R10 with a little bit of solder. And I've cut some wire and I'm gonna poke a hole. There's actually holes in the R8, R9, R10 points. So I have that thin gauge, was it 30 gauge wire, and I'm gonna poke holes in there, heat it up, and it should just stick in there. And then I'm gonna attach 10 to B, 9 to G, and then 8 to R. It's just another B or RGB, and 8, 9, 10. So once I get those all soldered in together, then this is already done. Just a matter of putting the cable, and the C-Sync is not on this particular board, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get it to work today. So if you notice, it's an NUS CPU 04 board, and I believe you need to have a lower, like an 02 or an 01. Even though this is a first generation bought on the first day, launch day, it's still, I guess, they went through a manufacturing process where they changed it midway, or at some point, even on the launch day machine. So if you have an 03 or higher, it doesn't have composite sync. So you won't be able to get the RGB signal to work unless you have the N64 SNES RGB sync on Luma cable. And you can buy those on eBay. So instead of syncing on composite, it syncs on Luma, and that's what you need. So I will finish this off. I'm going to go ahead and try it, but I suspect that it's not going to work unless for some miracle reason it has composite sync, which I don't think it's going to. But you can actually put composite sync on this thing, but it requires a resistor and soldering into pin, I think 14 of the video chip, and then it's not even really guaranteed. So I'm just going to wait a couple of days for my cable to come in and then give that a shot. But I think it'll be okay. Let me just get these things going here. You should still be able, you don't lose the ability to use a regular video cable. So in the meantime, I can still use the N64 as just a regular standard composite video. The 8, 9, and 10 go into R, G, and B. And the solder points are all good. So now a matter of just testing it. Honestly, it's probably not going to work until I get that cable, but at least I should test to see if the RCA video still works. That shouldn't go away. Now, one thing to remember, because I've done this before and I forgot the first time and it kind of freaked me out because I thought I did something wrong. When you do a test, you don't actually have to put it all the way back together. Right? So you can put the cartridge in, right? Got Mario Kart 64 here. You can put the cartridge in, give it the power, plug in the power brick, and then plug in the multi-out, and then it wouldn't come up. What I forgot was there needs to be something here, either the expansion pack, which I have, the memory expansion pack, or the jumper. If you don't have any memory expansion pack, you need some sort of jumper to connect those things, because if you don't, nothing happens. It's just black, and I thought I had screwed up my N64 the first time. So anyway, so with this in place, I'm going to give this a shot and see. At the very least, it should still have, if I haven't screwed up, it should still have the composite out, and I'll give the RGB out, and I suspect it's not going to work. But anyway, let me go. All right, here we are. I'm about to test the RGB mod on this N64. Couple of things. Don't forget to put, I know I mentioned it last time, but I can't stress this enough. Don't forget to put the expansion pack or the jumper pack, if you don't have the memory expansion pack, in its place, because if you don't, the memory isn't terminated and you will just get a black screen and you will be scratching your head and redoing the solder like I did off screen because I didn't put it in initially. And I couldn't figure out why all the soldering looked fine and it wouldn't come up, but I was trying to play back in my head, does it have to be in the shell? Is it not grounded? What's going on? Then I noticed the memory pack or the expansion pack, and I was like, oh man, it doesn't work without it. So plug that in, and now I should be able to test it. And then this is just the power just kind of free floating in there because it's not in the case. And then the multi-out's connected to RGB cable that I was using for the Super Nintendo Mini, which has the exact same RGB mod, just in the just in the SNES Mini. And if you have an SNES Mini, I highly recommend that you RGB mod it, because the SNES Mini is the best, gives you the best RGB signal of any Super Nintendo versions. It doesn't do S-Video by default, it doesn't have composite sync by default, but the SNES Mini is the best way to go. But anyway, so it's all hooked up. This is on a flipped over shell, it's just the bottom of the N64. And that cable is not supposed to work. This thing's not supposed to work, but it worked. So one of two things had to have happened. I guess one of three things. Either the information I read was wrong, or the version that I have of this board just happens to have composite sync, even though it shouldn't. Or the most likely thing is that this Super Nintendo RGB cable is doing sync on Luma, which is what you need if you don't have composite sync on your N64. It could have been when I bought the Super Nintendo RGB cable, I didn't even take a look at what kind of sync it had. I just assumed it was composite sync, because I did hook up the composite sync back on the Super Nintendo Mini to get that to work. But I was shocked when I turned this on and it powered on and gave me a beautiful RGB signal. I was shocked. It wasn't supposed to work. So this monitor is a Sony rebranded monitor. It's actually branded Olympus. It's an OEV 2003. I highly recommend these monitors. They look fantastic. They have 2 RGB ends, but people tend to ignore them because they don't have the Sony badge on them. But it's a Sony Trinity. You can even tell. It's right here. It says Trinity. It is a Sony PVM, just rebranded. It's rebranded for medical use. It's sold to this company Olympus, and they just market it for medical companies instead of for video production companies. But it's a really good monitor. It has a speaker built in. It's got a single mono speaker. I don't use it. I use stereo speakers, but you should really look for those on eBay. They're always much cheaper than their Sony equivalents, and they're exactly the same thing. They're just rebranded, different badging. So anyway, it looks like it was a success, even though it shouldn't have been, but hey, I'm not going to argue with success. So now all you need to do is put this sucker back together and it should be good to go. Okay, back from the test. It was successful. Lucky for me, right? I actually tried a different cartridge. There's a Kirby 64. It was just another test. Worked great. Now we're just going to put it back together. One thing that I would recommend you do, again, there's the final product. But one thing that I recommend that you do is, since you have this thing apart, is just go ahead and give it a little bath, you know? This one had some web, you know, like spider webs inside and some dust bunnies and stuff like that. So I cleaned it out a little bit, but I'm going to show you how to take out the buttons. It's pretty simple. There's clips here. So you just push those two together and just kind of shove it out. It should just come right out. And, well, eventually, if you use this flathead screwdriver. Okay, it's coming. Okay, so there's the reset button. You can see there's some gunk in there. So if you have squeaky buttons or buttons that aren't moving really smoothly, this is a good time to go and clean those out. And same thing for the power button. That just comes straight out. So the sliding mechanism, I guess, is that part of the power? Yeah, I guess that's part of that. Okay, and the one thing remaining here is the doors for the cartridge, right? So that's pretty easy to do. There's just a couple of screws, very obvious. So there's one there, and one here. Okay, hopefully I got a little bit better centered this time. And then these doors, they will come straight out, and they're spring loaded, so don't be careful with those. I like to take out all the parts that are not metal, so everything else is just plastic. So at this point you can just take this and throw it in. What I like to do is just some mild dishwashing soap and just a, you know, like a cleaning sponge or a dish rag, and just give it a good once over. It'll make a world of difference. I don't really like to submerge these, so I'll just give them a little rub down on the drawers themselves, but I don't like to get the springs wet. I don't want to get them rusty, so I'll just leave those. Actually, it goes like this. I'll just leave those there. And one little part here that you can just remove easily is the power LED light diffuser. That just comes straight out, so no big deal. And then of course you have all these. That's the expansion port, which you probably will never use unless you have a 64 DD. So that. All right, so I'm going to take this into the kitchen, give it a good once over with some dishwashing soap and water, warm water, and I will be back. Okay, everyone, it's time to put this thing back together. I've taken it out of the little bath I gave it. Just some warm water and dish soap, just mild detergent. I don't recommend you throw this into the dishwasher, but for all I know, this sucker's dishwasher safe. If you guys try that, let me know in the comments if that worked for you, but I'm not about to try it on mine. Anyway, it looks pretty good, very clean. You know, just take a dish rag and get into the crevices and everything, clean it all nice, and let it air dry. Make sure it's all dry before you put this back together, of course. And I think I said in the last part of the video that I didn't want to take the metal parts out. What I meant is I did want to take the metal parts out. Obviously, I don't want them to rust. That's why I took the part with the springs out, and I took these little screws off of this part that holds that together. So it's time to put it all back together, and just speaking of those parts, let's put those back in. So these spring-loaded doors are pretty easy to get in. You can't really screw them up. They go right into the slots, and there's a little groove for the spring to fit right into. And there's a slot there that goes right there, so you can't mess that up either. And there you go. That's all in place. It should work. Great. And now let's just screw these little things back in there. Oops. There's one. And you don't want to screw these in too tightly. They should be snug, but because you're screwing into plastic, you could easily strip these very easily. So just be careful. That looks good. What are we missing here? We're missing the buttons. And these are just going to snap right in there. And you got to really get around the buttons. Over the just time, you get a lot of dust and gross stuff in there. You know, if you got messy kids, maybe they've got some food or stuff jammed in there, and it makes it so they don't they move very smoothly. So make sure to clean the buttons out very well, and the power button as well. Right, so reset and power buttons, they look good. And then where is the top? So obviously we're gonna put the memory expansion in there, but for now, so we don't lose it, we'll put that on there. So there you go. There's the top reassembled. Bottom one's going to be a little bit more complicated because that's where the motherboard goes, right? So here's the bottom. I'll go ahead and put the expansion port cover back on. And yeah, this had cobwebs and stuff in there, so just getting in there, the grating and cleaning that all out looks great. So the motherboard, and here it is again. So I taped over the parts where I've soldered onto the RGB amp and onto the board itself, just so kind of keeps it from moving around, also protects it from making any weird contacts with the shielding or anything else. So I just put a little bit of electrical tape on there. So initially I was going to put electrical tape underneath the RGB amp. I forgot. The instructions say you don't need to, it's just recommended, so I guess it's okay. I mean, it looks fine. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it as is. It would be really difficult to unsolder that anyway. Here's the shielding. The shielding fits in there, but you probably want to do it this way first. It's just a lot easier to put the shielding onto the motherboard and then the whole thing onto the case itself. All right, so there we go. Got that on there nice and snug, and you'll see the RGB amp is perfectly located right there, just the right shape to avoid the shielding. So let's flip that back over. And what am I missing? I'm missing something. I'm missing a few things. So this LED light diffuser for the power goes right there. And these suckers fell out when I wasn't looking, so I didn't know where they go, but I looked them up and they just dropped right in there. No big deal. This thing, you'll notice there's kind of a lip on the controller ports, and right here on the power, you can actually just slide them right into the groove here. So this part actually covers the multi-out. I should probably just slip that on there for now. It goes right there, and then let's just slip it all in there. It should just drop right in. Should just drop right in. All right, there you go. Multi-out's good. Nice and secure. I think we got it nice and snug. Good. All right, so now it's just a matter of putting the screws back where we found them. And again, I put all the screws in the same location relative to each other off screen. So I'm just gonna grab those and just go in reverse order. I don't think it matters exactly which order you go into as long as you get them all back in there. Let's do the power first. And I've been using this method all for every time I take this. I've taken it off screen, I've taken it apart and put it back together a couple of times because the amp actually came a little loose one of the wires came loose and I wasn't getting the blue, but I fixed it. So I'm getting pretty good about putting these things back together now. If you ever have trouble with the screws, again, I mentioned it earlier, but just do a counterclockwise motion a little bit and you'll get a little snap like that, and then you can go forward and put the screw down pretty smoothly. Sometimes you just run into screws that get stubborn. You don't want to force them because, again, they're plastic, so you could easily strip them out. So now we'll do the controller port. These are the long screws. That will in perfectly. And this guy, oh, there we go. Got to snap into the groove. Great. And now here's where my N64 differed from the picture on retrorgb.com. Mine has a screw here. And I think it's just an error on their picture. There's no way to have a screw there. It's just there's a post there. So it's just slightly off. There we go. Got it into the groove. Great. And I will do these two. Now, these two, since they're sunken in, I'm going to use this little short stubby one because it's got a magnetic tip just to get it started. Okay. The one here. All right, cool. Get that one started. All right, that one's done. And that one's done. So next two will be here, and this bolts down some of the shielding. And we're getting close here. These are actually short little stubby ones. And now we're going to go with these long ones that cover or bolt into the memory slot. Now for this, you can't use a regular screwdriver. You have to use this little tiny one, which is the same one that I used to open up the N64 controllers, by the way. If you ever need to clean those. I almost made a video on that, but I'm glad I didn't, because what happened was I had this controller that I bought this came as part of an N64 that I bought at a flea market. Really good price, 35 bucks for an N64. And the reason, he wanted 50, but it had an expansion pack, the 4 meg one, just like this. Not this one, but just like this one, included, and he didn't know. And also came with a memory card for the for saving memory, for saving games. That goes into the controller port, also included. But the controller ended up being a Circa, C-I-R-K-A, which is a third-party knockoff. They look very similar, very, very close to the Nintendo64 official controllers, except they don't have the Nintendo logo. So I was, when I got the controller, it was the stick was all screwed up. It was very stiff and squeaking, so I went to the trouble of taking the whole thing apart and cleaning it. I actually got it working fairly well, and then I realized it's not even an official Nintendo controller. Why am I even bothering? But anyway, that story came about because of this screwdriver that I use for that task as well. So I think we got mostly everything except for these two. So let's go ahead and do those. So I figured out at the beginning of the video, I didn't know why this guy was missing on both N64s opened up and on the picture of retrorgb.com, and I figured out why. It is because that goes to that, which is the where you put the security bit. The game bit goes right in there and it attaches underneath of that. So that's why you don't have one there. Alright, so I think we got it going
all we need to do is put the shell on. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I hope this time that the wires didn't come loose. All right, that looks good, because that sucks when that happens. So I give it a couple of tests with some games just to make sure it wasn't my eyes deceiving me. What happened was, I think the blue was off, and it just looked very yellow, and it just looked off. And at first I couldn't tell, and then the game loaded, and I'm like, there's something definitely wrong with this color. And when I resoldered, made the soldering connections again, and yeah, tried it again, it came up much different and better, in the correct way, I should say. So you gotta be careful. Yeah, those wires are just really, really small and very fragile, so it's easy to get them perfectly soldered and then have them snap off because they're so thin. If you move them around too much back and forth, they'll just break. Once they're in there, it should be fine though. That's why I put that tape in there too, to kind of hold them in place, just in case so they don't jostle around. It's not like I take this thing around. I don't move my N64 a whole bunch, but still, it's good to have a little extra security. What is wrong with this screw? Well, I'm going to leave that one alone. It seemed like it was just kept going, which I hope doesn't mean it was getting stripped. Why isn't this one going now? Okay, just needed a few more turns. So maybe the same thing with this one. Yep. It just needed a few more turns. No problem. Cool. Well, there you have it. The completed N64. Just need to put this little final touch in. And now I have a RGB modded N64. All right, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, just a quick epilogue video of Mario Kart 64 running on the RGB modded N64 that I just worked on. I borrowed the Super Nintendo Mini's RGB cable, and it's going to RGB port A on this Olympus OEV203, which again is just a Sony rebranded monitor. And there you see it's RGB port A, and there it is. Working great. So it's a shame you can't really tell how good this looks on video, especially on YouTube. It's all compressed and everything, but it looks really, really good. The colors are super vibrant. The text is really sharp. It's the best you're going to be able to play. It's the best way to play these old retro video games. I have an RGB modded Super Nintendo Mini. I have an RGB capable Genesis. I think they're all capable of RGB, so I use that, and RGB Neo Geo, and they all look amazing. Even the NES, which I don't have RGB modded yet, looks amazing in composite on these PVMs. So if you don't have a PVM, you should definitely think about investing in them. They're really worth it. Anyway, thanks again for watching. If you have any questions, like I mentioned before, just put them in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.